Alrighty. So normally we're live. We'll just wait a second as people get the notification that we've started to join, and yeah, we will see how many we have joining us. Thank you wherever you are in the world joining us today. Um, If you have any questions during the live stream, by all means, feel free to put them in the comment section and we will be happy to answer them. This is focusing on really how to leverage your language skills. This is something as a career coach that I've found, and also I know Benjamin has found in his career as well, being a language expert and also being a former recruiter. So we're going to talk about language, language learning, the importance of language, and how you can leverage your own language learning skills when looking for a job. So, thanks again, everyone, for joining us. I'll just give a brief introduction, but we'll get more into it as we go through the live today. I have joining me, I'm super excited. I have Benjamin Hall joining me today, and it's fantastic. I'm really glad he agreed to this because he is by far the person that I know that really sees the value in languages and is a huge advocate of languages. Um, Benjamin started out his studies in language and moved into sales. From sales, moved into recruitment, and is now going back and is now teaching languages and promoting the importance of languages through school. So, Benjamin, with that brief introduction, would you like to go ahead and say hi and say a few words about yourself and about your journey to languages?
Sure. Well, Susan, always happy to see you. Thank you for the invitation as well. I guess what's important for me when I self-identify and everything is just to acknowledge that I'm a first-generation college student, So I just took Spanish in high school and it just clicked and opened an entire world to me. And from then on, I started adding languages and found I loved people. And it really just saying yes to lots of opportunity or being really determined to get where I wanted to be led me into the fields that I chose. And been having a great time ever since.
Yeah, something a little bit about your background. I know that you uh, you did your bachelor's in Roman language, so you were studying primarily French and Spanish. And if I'm not incorrect, you also went to Central America where you were doing volunteer work as well during your studies.
Right. So I had this unique opportunity where studying abroad, at least in the US, is very expensive, right? You have to pay the university a few $100s just to apply. And then you have to find your plane ticket and organize everything. So I like to consider myself savvy. And at that time, our sociology department had an internship in Nicaragua. And I knew someone who went before me. And so I harassed the professors and like, hey, what about me? This and everything. And so that was my first time, I think, 21, ever getting on a plane, going outside of the country, and lived in Nicaragua for 3 months or so and worked in like with an NGO and in small farming communities in the mountains. And I really got to immerse myself in my Spanish degree. And then later on from that, um, did this really interesting thing where I went to, that was from January to April. And then from April until August, I went and studied it in Germany and received a stipend from the German government to go through and study there on the northern border with Denmark and Flensburg. And used a lot of Spanish in Germany and still had a great time.
And when did you start learning German? Because you mentioned about learning already learning Spanish in high school, and then adding French to the mix in college as well. And then, yeah, when did you start? When did your German language journey start?
Yeah, I would say definitely like high school, just independently with friends. So my hometown is Greenville, South Carolina, and we have Michelin and BMW headquarters there. So I grew up being exposed to a lot of French and German speakers, along with Spanish speakers, right? So it was really cool. But when I got to college, that's when I first kind of jumped into German studies, and I ended up minoring in German, and I was terrible at it. because I was so used to Spanish and French grammar, and then trying to remember to put a verb at the end of a sentence in German instead of immediately after. Gave me headaches for some years, and until I had a chance to move to Germany, and then later on Switzerland, and then I had to learn the language by necessity of survival, right? Working in German or in French, and then answering calls and just thinking, oh, this customer is really angry, or maybe they're just German because that's how I think they sound, until my language skills got better. And so it was a constant um, process, right, to go through and
Mhm.
improve language, to try to help people during the day, to close sales in German, to handle customs documents and these kind of things in German, then taking classes in the evening or finding speaking partners and making friends, and a full immersion by fire, really,
That's something also I wanted to mention is, as a disclosure, Benjamin and I went to the same undergrad university together, and there was this perception of language learners like, oh, you're majoring in language. What are you going to do with that? And pretty much everyone across the board saw this as not a useful degree. Um, I know, Benjamin, yourself, when you would tell people this was, they would really think, okay, well, you can only teach with this. Yes, you can teach with this, but it opened up so many doors. So I just would love for you to tell people um, your experience, not even graduated from Winthrop, and how you got into your first role.
Right. That's very true. I have a close friend of mine who's now a child psychiatrist and doctor, and she's amazing and really like passionate about what she does. And I remember her looking at me and saying, "The Spanish degree, so you can learn the same thing a 4-year-old does." And I was like, uh-oh, wound to the heart, right? Which is fine, but I think the biggest thing is always to mix it with some kind of technical skill. And so I tell my students now, and I've told students when I was teaching at the college level and things, well, you can be really great at a language and it's wonderful, but the real world still needs some kind of technical skill or some kind of applied meaning to it. So for myself, what I did was I was very much in love with the language department and did not plan to leave. But I did take some management courses as well as I got into my junior and senior year, and then taking on more kind of activities, so that when I was in my last semester, I started looking for jobs and found a part-time job that was going to go full-time with this e-commerce that had an office in Switzerland. And at the time I just thought I would go to the career center and things and say, oh, I really want to find a job where I can use all 4 of my languages. And they're like, yeah, well, good luck. you know and that's the career center. I'm paying you guys to help me, come on. But it worked out really well. I think I just when you're, I guess, raised up in your first generation and stuff, and think no is not an option. Like people say you go to college and you get this liberal arts education and you become well rounded. That's wonderful, but I went for social mobility, right? And I had a lot of people's dreams on my shoulders, to see me make it, and I didn't have any intention of not doing so. And so for me, it was really cool because then when I ended up with this position, it was part time before I even graduated, and then went full time. And we probably have time that we can go in later. I think to where I ended up in Switzerland, managing that office within 2 years, 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, and this was thanks also to those language skills because you were working with different customers and being able to work with people within different markets. So um, it was actually a value, all of the languages that you were able to contribute um, to that. I know that you are a big believer in languages and language learning and yeah, using language in a variety of situations. When it comes, what would you say are some of the main benefits of people who are multilingual, bilingual, trilingual, polyglot in general?
Right. Well, I'd say for sure, the first thing is that even if you just study a language just for fun, which I encourage everyone to do, right? You can get on Duolingo, you can watch YouTube series or watch the Netflix with subtitles and these kind of things. Um, Ultimately, it helps you with your own first language, right? You understand your own grammar better. So when I first started studying language, I could not tell you in English what a verb was. Like we learned it in school, but how often do you, as a native speaker, need to identify grammar in your first language, right? And so it strengthens you as a writer and a reader because you think more intentionally about words, right? And then I think the biggest thing about language learning is that you start to think from another perspective. It's not always, well, this is why I think this and this is, and I'm the only right answer in the room, right? You started to consider that. And you also, if you learn a language, you do yourself a disservice if you don't also start learning some host cultures. Right. So for Spanish, that's 20 plus countries, but you do start to think, okay, well, how is this viewed from a Spanish point of view or a Mexican or like a Dominican point of view or like this, right? So you start to go through and think about this and how like they might have different values and or societal expectations within their own groups, right? So when you
Mm.
interact with those groups in a business setting or if it's an emergency situation or things, you kind of have an understanding of cultural norms, right? And I think that at least as Americans or as Anglophones, you don't normally think about we're content to stay in our own community and assume that most people have the same values as we do or that they have the same mindset that we do. And you learn a lot more when you go into a situation admitting you don't know everything, but you're willing to learn and ask questions and you're prepared to be wrong sometimes.
Mhm. How would you say your first experience was when you went to Nicaragua, your first time experience abroad using another language, um, versus your last experience abroad and like speaking and being in a foreign place? I know that's a very like
Right.
complicated question, but I'm just interested a little bit to learn more about kind of yeah, if there was a change there, a shift in you.
Right. I would say definitely my first time, like I mentioned before. Here I am, 21. I've never been on a plane before out of the country, and Nicaragua. The people are so lovely. The country is so beautiful and things. But it was not what I expected because you build up the idea of studying abroad or living abroad in your head so much. It's kind of like this. Sorry. This like the Tokyo syndrome or the Paris syndrome that Japanese people have when they come to Paris, right? And they built it
And
up so
yeah, they're shocked that it's
right,
not what.
right, and everything, and they're so not necessarily underwhelmed, but like it just it can never match the fantasy you have in your head, right? So I remember being in Nicaragua, and it's a country with beautiful people, but also like it has its own issues, right? And I was there in 2011, and just seeing the difference in like the way the streets were and the way that people lived and things too. After a few days, I'm homesick, this kind of thing. I'm just like in tears, a grown man, it's in tears and whatever and stuff. And it took me a couple of days to kind of process and things, and then I jumped in and I got into the loop, right? And then there's also the difference in the language you study in the classroom or that you practice with other language learners versus the real language that you engage with, right? So,
Mm,
of course, Spanish is spoken in 20 plus different countries, but each region has its own kind of thing, right? Or each country can have its own accent or several accents within one country. And so to go there and think I knew Spanish perfectly and everything, and then to go in and like realize, oh, in Central America, they clip off the ends of words, right? They kind of eat the word, the end of the word. Or they might say other things where I've kind of prepared more classroom style, right? So compare
mm,
that to my last time abroad, probably was France, I want to say, like when I was there teaching
mm,
English. So that was in 2019, 2018, like this. And there I went in, even if my French wasn't perfect, I went into these situations. I'm like, okay, yeah, I need to get this at the pharmacy or, oh, I'm at the hospital for something. And kind of make lots of, I'm going to laugh at myself because I know the situation is so weird. I might speak French with a weird accent, or I might not be understood by these people because they've never encountered like an English speaker, because it's a smaller town. And I just learned to laugh at it and realize people were really interested in seeing my passport. And I'm like, please, it's the emergency room. Could I get some help? Like, look at my passport later. Please help me, right? And I think part of language learning and just living in different cultures is learning to laugh at yourself, even on those frustrating days, because the
mm.
the shine wears off of studying abroad when it becomes your normal day to day, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think this is very much true for people who even decide to move abroad for whatever reasons they want to change or they're moving for their work. That at first it can be this shiny idea, and then all of a sudden, whoa, this is not the expectation that I thought. But okay, I'm getting into the groove of things, but still, I have a lot to learn. And it very much, I think, is a moment of processing all of these different steps and all of these different things because it's essentially um, changing everything you thought you knew because we only have the foundation of our own home countries typically, unless you are privileged, I would like to say, of being a third culture kid where you get to grow up naturally around so many languages and don't need to go out and seek them. Um, with this, I really wanted to talk about kind of language and language skills and how they relate to career. Um, First, I just want to, we can talk a little bit more about your experience with mixing language and career and how it's benefited you. And then I would like to move on and have you put on your recruiter hat. And then we talk about also how you saw it as a recruiter and what kinds of things that you saw and worked with in the recruitment sphere. But first, what did you see in your own career just by knowing languages and being aware of language and cultures?
Yeah, to be honest, like my first, I guess, real job, out of college and things, was working for this e-commerce, and would not realize like that it was the gaps that happened because language wasn't understood, right? For example, coming in and being the only one that could speak English and Spanish, where part of the workforce is primarily Spanish speaking, so they're relying so heavily on Google Translate or these things. And no disrespect to Google and stuff, but anyone that's used it knows it's not always quite correct, or the vocabulary like can vary so much by countries.
Yes.
People, if that workforce mostly is from Honduras or from El Salvador, and you're using Spain Spanish, right? You're using Castellano. It's a lot different, right? And in some ways, right? And so the meaning can get lost even using a translator. So I think being able to fill those gaps, or like trying to see businesses service certain markets, but they have no language capacity to do so, right? So you can't serve Quebecois customers, right? If you don't have any French on your website, if you don't have a French speaker on the phone to help, or one that is willing to hear Quebecois speak, right? Because
Mhm.
metropolitan France, they're like, just speak English, right?
Yeah,
um,
it can, and even then, just like you said with Spanish, French as well can very much vary between Quebecois and French spoken in France because there are even yes, with the accent, but even the words that they switch out and they use differently.
yeah, so I mean, there's always this. So I think for myself, it was just the idea of like we kind of dismiss language in some ways, I think, but you don't realize that it's so much needed. And that's why I think people, when they come in and they like, if you speak another language, and I've met lots of people who like, they come in and they're like, oh, I speak this language, but you did not hire me extra, or you didn't pay me extra for knowing this language. So I don't speak that language at work unless I'm getting a differential or some kind of pay for it, which is fair. I mean, you should also lobby for yourself, right? I mean, you should make it known like this is a skill that I bring to the table. And if I didn't have it, you would not want me, because I know I've been hired for plenty of interviews and stuff where they went through, and I think when I was living in Charlotte, I wanted to test my Spanish, and then we switched to German. I'm like, okay, I'm ready. Let's do this, and it's very fun to see that. But also, like you have to know your worth when you come in, right? And I would encourage people, like a good friend of mine who's a speech pathologist, who is studying Vietnamese, right, or studying Spanish or speaks Spanish beautifully. But she goes into those things and she knows the value she brings to it, and she knows how to negotiate for herself to get the pay that she deserves, right? And I think it's one thing to know language, but it's so much more when you realize, oh, it makes a difference in what opportunities are available. If there's an assignment abroad, right? I mentioned before, that little e-commerce, ended up moving me to Switzerland a few years later because there was an opening, and instead of hiring someone there, I knew the business model, I knew their values and expectations and things, and sent me over, I think, to run the office for a few years, and so you just have to know your worth, I think, as well. And then like
Mhm.
even if you're studying a language for fun, it's still some kind of value that you're bringing, some kind of perspective that you can offer to teams.
Yeah, I always say when I'm helping someone with their resume CV, I'm always saying that if you speak an intermediate level or above of a language, absolutely add it to uh, to the CV resume because you never know who might be interested in that language. And sometimes it's not even about anything related to the language. Sometimes it can be that the manager of that department is, I don't know, half Vietnamese, and
Yeah.
you have an intermediate level in Vietnamese because you've been studying it, and they feel this affinity and comfort with you because you can have a basic conversation back and forth with each other. So it's kind of like a something you have already in common with them. Already you may have the great skills for the job, but it's something that makes you a little bit more of a better match for them because you have, yeah, you have this thing that you can have additionally.
And we think also within the U.S., of course, you wouldn't like you could put a language that you're interested in or language that you speak at least I would say intermediate level. If you're a beginner in it and stuff, like it's nice to put, but don't claim fluency and don't set yourself up, right? Um, but I think when I was living in Switzerland and stuff too, it's very common to see people on their resumes write their interests and hobbies and things. And it could be like I've seen some that wrote like, oh, kayaking, or some that wrote Russian literature, or some like classical music, or whatever kind of things it spends, right? Um, and it's so interesting because you never know what those connections are because at least within Switzerland, I don't want to generalize for all Europeans and stuff. They look at the resume and they think, is this a person who has similar interests to our team? Okay, they like to do something outdoorsy, or they have this unique interest that a lot of us are also interested in. And it can make a difference, right? I mean, people are really interested in that part. And I think it's something that we don't really consider too much.
Yeah. And that's that is an interesting point about the difference that Europeans often add hobbies, not just Switzerland, but all over Europe. They tend to add a hobby section. And that's just so that you have something else actually to even mention in the interview if that person interviewing you has that overlap as well, because it's building this thing that you have in common with the other person. It's making that connection in
Yeah.
some way.
It's so interesting because I was at this event, I think around Christmas time or so, and I met this German professor of finance who's a really nice person, but was very like slow to start in the conversation and things too. So talking about his classes that he's teaching and this and thing, and the conversation is kind of lulling, and I'm like, oh my gosh, let me escape this thing, right? And I just like, okay, like what about hobbies? Do you do anything? It's like, and then his eyes lit up, and it was oh, talking about kayaking. And he and his wife go and enjoy doing this and everything, and like and it changed so much, and that's really the difference too, is knowing these interests. So then if you find someone that also has an interest in language learning or traveling, which a lot of people do and stuff
Yeah.
too, oh, like it becomes an easy way to break the ice and start developing that relationship because oh, you went here, I'm thinking about going there, please, what tips do you have, or what would you recommend, or what should I avoid, or this kind of thing, or local restaurants that specialize in that delicacy, right?
Hmm.
So if I'm here in the US, now in New Orleans and stuff, if I want some kind of German food, okay, well, there's a small German population here, so where do I go to find it? Or there's authentic Chinese restaurants and stuff instead of this Americanized version. Where can I find that? And it's all through these conversations and making those connections.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think another thing about when you make these connections is finding people that have this shared interest in culture, um, but also people that you can even practice those language skills with. I know, I know with language, if we're going back and looking at kind of the CV and resume, that I don't know if you also felt the same when you were doing recruitment, but I often feel people don't highlight these skills enough. I often find that sometimes the language section is really at the bottom of the CV resume, like almost hidden to the side or mixed in with some other long list of skills. So I have to actually seek out that information. Whereas there are some companies that very much value those language skills. And but it's just not prominent enough within people's professional materials that they're submitting for applications.
Right. I think also it kind of becomes even if you are a native speaker of a certain language, let's say like Hungarian, right? Unless you have a very, like specific name that identifies with the culture immediately, people aren't going to assume that. So you can
Yes.
have the language on your resume, but ultimately it also depends what you've been able to do with that, right? So for example, if I have Spanish on my resume, but I never tell you that I worked in Spanish, or I've never worked with teams using Spanish to solve issues or to increase sales numbers or something like this, it doesn't mean a lot, right? So you have to be
Yes.
kid because it's wonderful to grow up bilingual, for example, but if you have not put that into practice in a business sense, it's not necessarily a value to that business. You have to kind of spell it out for them and show them, like, for example, myself, like when I've worked for these different companies, okay, well, I reached into this market in Mexico or in Spain or in Austria, and I built this market up. I built this kind of process or this department, and show the numbers, right? Because the percentages, right, like the results, that speaks volumes for you. And to show that you can do this in two languages, right, whether it's your first language, if it's English or something, or like English and also Portuguese or something Italian, it makes a difference. And you need to spell it out and be your own biggest cheerleader on these things.
Yes, yes, yes. Um, exactly that, because if you're only uniquely listing it within a language section, it's not being highlighted enough. One of the things that I focus on when people speak several languages and they're going to go and they're targeting international companies, I explain, highlight that within your about section at the top, right, that you are a trilingual professional with 10 years of experience in HR. Write this out so they instantly know. Explain about how you've leveraged French, English, and German to support employees and employee partnerships within a company. Explain in detail how you've utilized those. It doesn't have to always be, like Benjamin said, it's wonderful if you have metrics. That's great because this really shows impact. But if you don't have metrics, at least explain some kind of result that came out of those um, those language skills that you have used. So you can talk about the language skills that you know within your summary at the top of your CV. You can weave it in as well within your job descriptions, explaining specifically how you use those language skills. Maybe it's even not even something that you think is a big deal. Um, I know that I was consulting with a client who was telling me that's fluent in English, but they told me that they never used it professionally. And only when I started poking and asking more questions that they did actually have like English only speaking customers, not necessarily native, but people that only spoke English that didn't speak French. And it turns out that all of her colleagues would direct to her because she was the one that spoke fluent English in the office. So I said, look, you've used English professionally. You had to answer emails and answer calls. And she goes, but that wasn't every day. I said, it doesn't matter if it's every day or even once a month. You did do that professionally. You own it. Um,
It's true. It's that business pain, right? Every time the business had that need, there you were to take care of it.
yeah, exactly. And even if it's not something, even if it was something one time that they had you work on a project because you spoke that language. I had a friend who years ago, she was hired in a hotel restaurant um, for a seasonal job because it was like a high vacation area. And they asked her to translate their menu into English and Spanish. And she was able to do that because of her language skills. That wasn't the majority of her work, but at the beginning of the season, that's what she did. And that's how she utilized those language skills. So try to think about your own experiences where you might have used those skills that you can talk about that within your resume and CV.
I would also say, like, when you're going through and using the business language in this context and things too, think of also, if you're interested in the language, then you're exploring it, you're studying it on your own, or you're taking in some kind of output or something. Like, you're doing this, like you're reading in the language, or you're listening to music in the language. You're doing something. So also think of the connections you find with those communities, right? Like if you love dancing and you take up tango lessons, right, or you go and learn I don't know, bomba or something like this. It's so fun, and it makes those genuine connections within that community, right? And then
Mhm.
you never know how the network works, like who knows who, depending on the city and stuff too. So maybe like when you find yourself in a hard time and things, right? That person remembers you, and you can reach out and say, "Hey, would you have any kind of introductions? I'm looking for this kind of role, or I'm looking to upskill in this or get a feel for that company. Do you know someone there?" Right? And so LinkedIn is wonderful, and I'm a big LinkedIn lover, but your own natural network is going to help you just as much.
What do you that's a great segue. Like, what do you mean by your own natural network?
Well, again, it's like if you are interested in a language or a culture, then I imagine you are invested in it. You're going out and doing this, right? So here, being in New Orleans and stuff, there are a lot of people here from Nicaragua, from Honduras, these places, or Colombia. So I'm going out to those restaurants, right? I'm doing this, or I'm making friends that also speak this through different groups or things. Or if there's like some kind of dance or festival or concerts, I'm going and I'm talking to people. And so when you do that, like you start to make natural friendships, right? It doesn't have to be forced and transactional. But if you know them and maybe like you can always ask your network first. Like if I'm interested in a company, right? I'm usually reaching out to my friends that work in that sector or who might have worked in a company that's adjacent to it to see, hey, what do you know that Glassdoor won't tell me about this company? Or can you make an introduction for me, right? Like, do you know someone in your network that knows this, right? Besides having genuine friendships and stuff too, friends look out for each other, right? And so, yes, we want to believe in meritocracy and these things too. Sometimes it's who you know, right? And that's no secret, right? So, I think it never hurts to have that, but as long as it's organic, right? Like you don't want it to be transactional. Don't hit someone up just because you need a favor to get a job somewhere. Like that's gonna waste their time. They're gonna feel used and stuff too. Make the investment to really get to know and build these relationships if that's what you're interested in doing. And maybe it works out in the end. If not, you always have someone to practice your language with. Right.
Yeah, I think that's I think this is the thing. I'm gonna break it down for people because I know that networking for us has become so second nature that we almost forget to break down all the steps. But you mentioned like, okay, you're interested in a certain culture and you're interested in being able to use those skills and find out about job opportunities related to this. When you go to a restaurant or when you go to some kind of festival, I mean, how do you meet someone? You go, but then what happens? Like what's the next step? Like how do you approach them?
Yeah, well, I learned from my dad, who has never met a stranger, which was awful because if you go to the store with him, you are stuck for 40 minutes at a time talking to people, and he's trying to guess how they know each other or trying to like make jokes and stuff. But now I realize it's such a blessing working in sales and dealing with people and working in education, right? But it really becomes just striking up a conversation, right? I think a lot of times when people are learning a language, there's the affective filter, right? So you're so nervous you're going to make a mistake that you don't allow yourself to engage with the language, and usually that's why events where you go and like have like some wine or something, it lowers that, so you don't feel as much anxiety. You can kind of engage and try it out, and that's worked a little too well for me sometimes. So careful if you invite me
Don't
to.
care anymore.
Right, right. Like it comes out and the German gets a lot stronger, right? And I'm like, we'll figure it out along the way. Uh, but I think it really goes into um, if you have the shared interests and stuff too, you want to go up and you want to start talking to people and practicing. And I don't think that's so crazy. Maybe like if you're German or some cultures where it's like they don't really do small talk as much, right? And which I respect, and that's fine because they value these more genuine friendships instead of just kind of our American and maybe British kind of ways of just like making small talk and then we're never gonna talk to that person again, right? So there's always this shift in culture, but you wouldn't know that unless you'd studied the language, right? So if you're an American, for example, or a British person who finds themselves in a German-speaking company, and you wonder why. When you ask someone how long answer and things too, and you don't really care and stuff, well, they consider you rude because your eyes have glazed over and you're begging to be freed from this conversation. But now you seem even more insincere because you asked about their day and they're going to tell you, right? So it's just you learn these cultural cues, right? And like these things, Americans, I think we have this idea of when you're having a conversation, you feel like, in like French or German or other people and stuff will kind of let there be a lull in the conversation to kind of process what's been said and kind of think about what is being discussed. Whereas Americans, we have this natural tendency to fill that gap, right? There's silence, so we need to keep talking. And if you work in business development or in sales and things, what's one of the philosophies, right? It's like just say a little bit and then stop talking, right? Like you don't need to go through and oversell something, right? Like you
Yeah.
can, the product and your service should speak for itself. But if you keep talking, you keep kind of convincing and this, I think, enough. Let people think, right? Let's let them reflect and have that moment. And I think that's something you only learn from dealing with those cultures and from studying, because you can speak the language fluently and have zero cultural competence when it comes to those countries or those people.
Yeah.
And you do yourself a disservice because you can speak the language really well, but you commit lots of faux pas that you don't need to do.
Yeah. And how do you bridge that gap where you speak a language, but you may not be familiar with the culture?
Yeah, I would say, again, because German and Spanish and French and stuff are spoken in so many different places, right? So when I lived in Burkina Faso, right, that culture is very different from metropolitan France, right, or from maybe Haiti. With these kind of things and the cultural expectations, you have to do your due diligence to go through, and a lot of that comes with getting to know people that speak that language, right? So again, it goes back to building your network organically, finding language partners. These kind of things to go through and just kind of understand. For myself, if you're single, you can also go on there and like try to like date in the language, right? And you'll learn a lot, trial by fire, like this. if you,
Yeah, lots
if,
of people always
you
say
know,
find a lover that speaks that language to practice it more, and
right.
then you have that even if the relationship doesn't last, those language skills do, and that goes on your CV and resume.
Yeah, and that relationship does not. So, um, I would think that, but also when you go through and do that, like it's just like having a close friend. Like when I taught in France, a lot of my high school students, there was such a difference between those who did not care about the language at all because they never saw themselves traveling, and those who were just naturally good at it because they learned language through online gaming. And you're talking about 15, 16-year-olds who spoke English without an accent and perfect
Yes.
high level language performance compared to like some students who in the US and stuff might struggle just to learn Spanish and to take it seriously because they don't see the connection to it, right? And so I think there's a huge right there's a huge difference in technology too, right? But I think a lot of those conversations and things that happen are the way you're going to learn, or these silly things online. You're like, oh, things Americans do that annoy others, right? Like being too loud in public when we go somewhere, or like tipping culture, or this kind of stuff, right? These things like you don't know it exists and it's a part of your culture until it's pointed out to you by another one,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's really cool. So
Yeah, absolutely. Um, what about those people that already have these really great developed language skills? I know because us both being from America, it's very rare to find people that have language skills. It's there's not really much of a focus, but I find in Europe it's really impressive that a lot of people are bilingual, if not trilingual. And that has a lot to do with the kind of the changing history of Europe, the borders, and also of the Eurozone, essentially the European Union, and being able to have the mobility to work and live in other places. Um, what would you say? Could you give some examples of what you've seen that people have done and how those language skills have helped them? Just as your experience networking and recruitment, what you've seen as you've been abroad talking to people that have extensive language skills.
right. I think for one thing, as people from the US, right, we kind of think of speaking any other language than English as, wow, it's so amazing. But in Europe, it's usually the standard, right? Not to paint with broad strokes, but usually someone that's working in tech, for example, like if they're from France and everything, they've probably learned English to a high level as well, right? Because again, online gaming or whatever, right? Or if they live like
The rise of Netflix. So many people tell me that they've watched TV shows and that's how they learned English. I'm always amazed.
and it works. I mean, like I personally don't have the time to go through and do the shadowing method, right, and just repeat everything the characters say because I'm very invested in the plot. But it's true. But I think that in Europe, it's it's kind of consider that you probably speak at least one other language, right? Unless you're like just working in a very specific industry. But if you're working nowadays in anything tech or anything any multinational company, they probably expect that you have at least English, right? So if you're in Germany, they're gonna say I speak a little English, and they're liars. They speak English
Oh
really
my
well.
gosh,
Yeah.
I know. Germans are the worst. Uh, I, I love really, they say they speak a little bit, and once they realize my German is really horrible, then they switch to English, and I swear it's really is like perfect formal, like sounds like the Queen of England, how she sounded. I'm always like, and you made me really try really hard in my German, which is a nightmare.
Right.
Um,
We're definitely like when I studied abroad in Germany, like trying to use my hands and feet to communicate because I did not have the language under control, and people going out of their way to really help me to navigate train systems and things and stuff.
yeah.
Things in my part of South Carolina, well, in South Carolina in the U.S., we don't have big public transportation. If you don't have a car, you don't go anywhere, right? And then like when you go to these smaller countries that have well-built infrastructure for this, you don't know how to navigate it necessarily if you've not been in a big city in the U.S. And so Germans are really lovely, but you start to see that kindness that they have and stuff. Instead of asking, "Oh, how are you?" and stuff, when you need help, they're there, right? And when they say, "I speak a little English," they mean I speak it fluently, and I wrote my dissertation in English. And like, do you swim a little? Well, I have a couple of Olympic medals, but that's about it, you know.
Yeah, they're very humble about it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Um,
I would
but
say
I,
that your question though,
yeah,
really going through when I worked in Switzerland, like in Zurich, like colleagues of mine that we also did a lot of work with companies in Morocco, right? And so we had some Arabic speakers that were there that grew up Swiss and everything too, but also spoke Arabic, and then others that would kind of come in and have learned different languages as well. So you'd hear French or Italian or German or English or Arabic at any given time. And a lot of the skill really became then those who came in who also had learned and put the effort in to learn Arabic, right? Who then could go in and work with the buyers when they went to Marrakesh or they went to Rabat or somewhere, and to get these products and source them and negotiate the deals, right? So much of that is overlooked, and it's just you have to start somewhere. And if you're willing or you're generally interested in language, it's so much fun to do. I think
hmm.
anyway.
Yeah, and even I find being a career coach and working with different people, sometimes you don't even realize a language, an importance of a language until haphazardly that it happens. I know that someone was applying for jobs in Germany and they didn't think to mention, and they had a very English sounding name. They were, I think that they were half, yeah, they were half American and I think half German. They had an American sounding name and they applied for this job in Germany. And what made them choose her at the end was her fluent Spanish skills because they were planning to expand their market into Spain. And it's not to say that she would be doing very much, like it's not that she was doing sales. She was doing a graphic design and website design, UX, UI, and they still said this would be great that this person can find faults if there's any within the language and text that we're putting out there in Spanish because this person was a, a very, very native, high level Spanish speaker. But that is the real difference between her and the other candidates.
I mean, it's true though. When you think of marketing or communications and things as well, it's like I often think of the toothpaste brand Colgate, right? I think so. Okay, it's really well known, very established. But when they went into Spanish-speaking markets, Colgate is Colgate. Hang yourself. No one wants to buy that kind of toothpaste, right? And so sometimes it's thinking of hopefully you have someone that understands the culture and the language, within your marketing departments or your sales department somewhere along the line that says, wait, or even a graphic designer, right? Who says, wait a minute, why are we suggesting this in the Spanish? What's wrong with them?
Yeah, this doesn't work in this market.
Like,
Absolutely.
you see so many things like this. I think here in the U.S., where I think there's definitely like a shift more into multiculturalism, which I think makes us richer, right? And I'm very grateful for to see that. So you see lots of more things in Spanish, or here in New Orleans, you see things in English, Spanish, and Vietnamese. And we like to put things in French to pretend that we speak it, but not so much. And but there's even an effort there to kind of revitalize and bring and strengthen Creole French and Louisiana French and stuff too.
Mm.
So it's beautiful to see. But you go through and you can read the thing sometimes you're like, oh, this is just machine translated, right? Because it definitely says this
You
and that,
can tell,
right?
yeah.
And Spanish, right, will use a certain word that could be considered very vulgar in different Latin American countries, like if you go to Argentina or you go to Mexico, very different. So then companies also have to kind of decide, like, well, if I'm doing this business here in the U.S. and I want to do appeal to Spanish speakers, which version of Spanish am I going to use, right? And so you kind of think, okay, for me, I would consider Mexican Spanish as more of a default nowadays because it is just like the U.S. as far as influence, right? A lot of
Yeah,
media coming
it's a neighboring country, so it has more influence naturally.
out there. It's a strong economy. Other people maybe like would say, okay, Colombia, right? Because they have a really clean Spanish, or it's like a more closer to standard Spanish in some way.
Spanish, yeah.
But if you go and like you use Chilean Spanish, okay, that's cool. But Chileans speak really fast and use words that even Spanish speakers don't use, you know. And so they're like, these Chileans are really nice. I don't know what they said though, like you know. So it's just
Yeah.
being aware
It's
of what.
being mindful of this, that of what kind of Spanish someone can bring to the table, and not just Spanish, but this goes for a multitude of languages. Um, I'm quite interested, um, just in just in talking about now, what would you what would you advise people when it comes to, oh, pop off. Hello again. What would you advise to people that are applying for jobs? How do they leverage their language skills? What is the best way for them to really show that this could be a benefit to a company?
Mm. I think for myself, it's whether it's certain projects that you worked on, you can highlight this, right? So, okay, if you had, let's say you work for a French company and then you go to work in something with automotive in Mexico on a project, right? And you're coordinating all this, it's important that you emphasize the role that your language played. Okay, so I was the bilingual coordinator for this role, or organized this between international teams between Mexico and France, right? It's so important to do that. Also, I would say when there's time also to go through and highlight, you know, if you volunteer or if you are parts of
Yeah,
organizations,
volunteer and yeah, as well.
you know, because it's such a huge thing. Even when I was in Switzerland, I was part of Terre des Hommes, right? That goes through and like raises lots of money for different kinds of programs in countries. So I'd learned about them when I was doing Peace Corps in Burkina Faso, right? And saw like, you know, aid coming through with this name on it, right? And so I kind of was interested to volunteer, even if you're working, you know, your full-time job. Either you join a society, right? Let's say you really love, I don't know, what's petanque, right? Or you want to go and learn how to do salsa dancing or something, I think too. It's so much more to show that you are involved in that culture when you can, right?
Yeah.
And that you invest in it. And so I think that that's a huge thing too, right? It's not just, okay, it's listed on my resume and here's my degree in languages, right?
Mm.
On the other side, like I mentioned before, like my students now, or when I was teaching college German, it's I'm so happy you love this language, but pair it with something, right? If you so a lot of people I know who studied French, but they also like are biology majors because they're interested in cosmetics, right? And so okay, you want to go and work in a lab creating cosmetics and things. You have the scientific background. You also have the language that's going to open those doors for you, right?
Yep.
And or if you're interested in a lot of my former students now that are in politics or engineering, right, who studied German and just loved it, even if they minored in German, right? So it was, and they still find ways to engage with the language and still join like Stammtisch events or create ones themselves or find these kind of different groups and things. Um, Language learning never stops, right? And so I think it's so important that you kind of highlight this in what projects you're continuously involved with. You know, you don't need to give 30 pages of this. You know, keep it relevant to the job you're applying for. I would say like, and you, I'm sure advise as well. You know, tailor your resume to these things. Know what that company is doing and what kind of um, you know environments they're going into, where they see their business going in the future. for me, it's like years ago, I understood, okay, French is valuable because French companies were also coming into Latin America to work with different mining kind of things, right? Which is ethical or not. But
Yeah.
you
Another topic, another day.
Right. So I mean, there was still this whole thing of like even when I was working as a recruiter in Switzerland, like people that were Italian, but they learned some Mandarin, and because of that, they were going. Their company was sending them over to China several times a year to go through and set things up and do testing and kind of bridge that gap where like email and like translations might have failed, and it's such a huge thing for that. And I think it's just
Yeah.
being aware of the business environment, and if there are companies that you have on your list that you're interested in, see where they have opportunities. You know, my own experience was, oh, this company had an office in Switzerland. You know, what did that look like? How do I get there? How do I get you to pay for me to go there? This, and you know, it was worth it to kind of understand what the business vision was, right? To kind of understand like
Mhm.
where they're going, and then when you are talking with them, you can kind of say, "Oh, I bring this to the table, right? I know who I am. I'm strong in this language. I understand this culture really well. So when you have that need, or I see you have this need now, here I am to bridge that gap."
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that,
I think that, and something else to connect the dots when it comes to for recruiters and hiring managers actually is studies have shown that people who speak more than one language, they're actually better at problem solving, empathy, and they're highly creative. So I think it's really important to highlight as well the other skills that come along when you learn a new language because you think differently, you know different things, you see things from different perspectives. That it's not just actually language skills that you gain from knowing a language. Um, so I do want to mention one more thing before we run out of time, and that is um, we just have kind of briefly talked on this, and this is really about advocating for yourself. So if you're going into a job interview and you know you bring all of these languages, um, you mentioned yourself, you're not going to use those languages in a sense if you don't feel like you are hired and pay for that kind of service, if you will. And that's something that I always tell people is that it doesn't they're not buying a piece of you in a sense when you're hired and you're paid a certain salary. They're getting you and everything you offer and that you can bring to the table. Do you have any recommendations or advice on how people can advocate for themselves when they are negotiating contracts, job contracts?
I think it's really important to know, you know, what your walkaway point is, right? Too, and to have this conversation. Okay, this is really nice, and this all goes through. You can have a lovely interview and things too, but when you're doing that, you also want to understand the kind of projects they're working on, or where they see themselves growing and stuff too, and how that relates to your languages, right? Just because you speak several languages does not mean that you're going to replace a translation department, right? Because even if you're a native speaker and you grew up bilingual, that doesn't mean you're a good interpreter, right? Doesn't necessarily
Yeah.
mean that you can do the translation work that's required for some kind of technical project. But when you're going through and you understand, okay, you intend to put me in this position, or you intend to have me work on this project primarily, focusing on this, well, then you have to do your market research as well, right? And you have to be willing to have that conversation with HR. It's very normal. And I think I probably did not know this until I joined recruiting myself. And everything was so much about being willing to have that conversation and say, "Oh, okay, this I see your offer. I see myself at this range, right? Or I see this. I think because I'm in highlight, because I'm bringing this experience in, because I'm bringing this language to your team that I don't see that you have yet, and this kind of stuff too. It's worth it to do. Like if you speak, I don't know, Esperanto, you know, which is like a interesting concept. Um,
Yeah.
is that really a business need and valuable? No. You know, like I don't see too many people working with that community, you know, like at least
Or
for
if you want to do it as a career coach, I would say if you really want to do something related to that, then let's seek out those companies that would value that. It's going to be very niche, but we
right,
seek them out.
right.
But yes, being aware how niche it is important
I
though.
mean, let's say for example, Finnish, right? I think lovely language, but unless you're working with a Finnish company and stuff, and I've seen that happen, like even in South Carolina, where there's lovely Finnish companies and things too. It's very niche, this language, right? So it's not as widely spoken necessarily and stuff. And if you put the effort into learning it, that's wonderful. But if you're working, I don't know, at IKEA, or you're working at some other kind of company, or like a German company, the likelihood that they need Finnish is a bit lower, right? So I think it's cool. Like I study Vietnamese. It does not mean that I expect them to pay me for 5 or 6 languages if they hire me, right? So I think it's being realistic and understanding the company needs and where you are. And it never hurts to do that market research and understand, like, check Glassdoor or check the equivalent, talk with your recruiter, talk with the HR department and stuff, and see where that salary is going to be, right? Because you don't want to have this thing where you're hired and 3 months later you're like, I don't feel like I'm paid enough, so I should do this. Like you want to start off and have it all squared away before you finalize it, and any kind of acceptance.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree. I read a study recently, and it was it was interesting for me, but they said that depending on the language and the market, and this was a European study, so this is European Union wide, but you could get between 11 to 35% salary increase, um, depending on, yeah, how much the need was of a certain language, within that country, within that market that you're serving. So just to remember, you shouldn't price yourself just according to what you see on Glassdoor, because they might not be taking into account a language that you speak, which is highly valuable for that company you're going to be joining. So make sure to keep that in mind when you go in and you're sorting that away through the employment contract. Um, just as a little bit of information, like, because I think maybe I should have asked you this in the beginning. Tell us, um, to date, how many different countries have you lived in?
Um, I think 5 or so, like so outside of the U.S. So from the U.S., then Nicaragua, Germany, Burkina Faso, Switzerland, and then France, right? So I guess. But in my future, I see myself moving to one more because I feel like 7's a good number. And stuff. But for now, I'm very happy, like in the US. We'll see how that goes. But I think it's always fun and it's cool to have opportunities there. So sometimes when you go through and kind of look and you think of, okay, could I make this move there? Yeah, you could, but it's still going to take some kind of language practice, I think, right? So, for example, if I'm like at the moment studying Mandarin and things, and so if I decide I want to move to China or Taiwan or somewhere, um, you know, um, then I need to have that language down, or at least to a pretty good level before I go there. One, and I've always felt this way about languages, that I feel like I need to know the language better to get there, and so I think that's just kind of something that
We're
I.
the complete opposite. I just show up and I'm like, I'm here. Oh,
The
crap.
good,
I
the
don't
good
speak the language.
The good thing is, when Susan showed up in France without any French, she was always willing to help people, like tourists that were lost, to the point of harassment. Like, well, I gave you,
Let me walk you there.
yeah, I gave you these bad directions in French, and let me give you more bad directions in French, and like really emphasize the point with hand gestures. But now you look in just a few short years, because you put the effort in. I mean, you came in, you were working at French companies, you were taking your studies seriously. This is what you immersed yourself in French culture, right? Like by joining this French family and things too. And
And Benjamin would have never expected this, because Benjamin was my Spanish tutor in college, which I failed Spanish because it was went that horribly for me.
think, yeah,
So
you had studied like 4 years of Spanish. I'm like, oh, I'm like, ¿cómo estás? You're like, me llamo Susan. I'm like, that's
yeah,
not like this, right?
awful. And yeah, and I think it's really interesting that what Ben always says is that, if one language doesn't work for you, it doesn't mean all languages are out the door. It maybe just means that language wasn't for you. So find another one, and you can have that experience.
Well, I tell a lot of my students now, so I'm teaching at a high school and teaching Spanish, and I love Spanish. I think it's a lot of fun. But I also make it more applicable to, okay, you're teenagers with jobs, so you're working in restaurants or in retail, these kind of things. So let's use functional, useful language for you, right? And a lot of my students are athletes that, play basketball or baseball, and they want to go on and join and, go pro or this kind of stuff too. And I explain to them, hey, I knew plenty of people in college who were there on sports scholarships and things too, who then it took their careers, like maybe they didn't make it NBA or MLB or whatever, but they found jobs and opportunities abroad. So people that I know who
Yes.
studied Spanish and everything, who are living in Austria and everything, and like because you knew Spanish, it helped you to learn a third language, right? If you're interested to do so, or to open that door to show that you already had a cultural awareness, that you're willing to learn different things. Or ones who moved to China, who have this huge like Chinese basketball league, right? Or this kind of thing too. And you get paid pretty well, right? Also, you go and do these different kind of things, or especially like soccer, right? If you're a soccer player, the
Mm.
game is loved everywhere except the US, where we're still a little suspicious of it, but it changes. So it's like, okay, you want to go and play for some countries in the Middle East and make good money. That's awesome, right? Like think Cristiano Ronaldo, right? He's Portuguese and then playing for different teams, right? And playing in
Yeah.
Italy too. Um, so don't limit yourself. And so my students who are interested in, I guess, in anime and things, and they want to learn Japanese, fun fact: Spanish speakers have an easier time learning Japanese because the syllables per second. This is similar, right? And so learning Spanish will help you on your track to learning Japanese, because you
Mm.
first have to learn, again, like remind yourself what a verb is, what this structure looks like, and then you can apply it to another language you learned, and it gets easier and easier.
And some people don't know about how closely related some languages are that even seem completely different. There's a lot of similar things between Spanish and Arabic in terms
Right.
of vocabulary. So it really is, once you know one language, it really is a door opener to additional ones.
There you go.
I know, and we're already at time. I knew we would talk plenty during this because we would have a lot to say on language. Do you have any last parting words that you would like to share with the greater community on language in life and in their career going forward?
Greater community of language nerds. Hello. I would say that if you're already learning a language, it's because you love it and you're passionate about it. And ideally, that works in some kind of business capacity if you want it to. But if it serves nothing else than your own enrichment, your own enjoyment, it's worth it, right? And even if it's only making friends in an office or in some kind of business setting that happen to speak that language too, and that gives you a chance to practice, that it's never a bad time to learn a language, right? And I don't think that people expect perfection. And I think if you are expecting perfection and when you're first starting to learn language, give yourself grace, right? Laugh at yourself, be willing to put yourself into situations where you're not understood, but it's all going to work out in the end, right? And it's a constant learning, right? So even, I'm a native English speaker. I'm still learning English words. I'm still learning things I don't know.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
language learning never stops. And so I would say enjoy the ride. And if you get bored with that language, switch to another and another and another and live your life.
Yeah. And if you're bad at a language like I was with Spanish,
Don't talk
go
about it.
try another one.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't tell other people, just go on to the next one.
Take Spanish off
Um,
your resume immediately and then add.
yeah, that's another thing. Studied for 4 years, cannot do anything but order a beer at a restaurant. I do not claim Spanish because
Still,
I cannot
still
do much
useful.
with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, true. Well, thank you so, so much, Benjamin, for joining us and sharing your expertise. I knew you would be great to talk to. And I knew, yeah, you would be wonderful to talk with, especially since you've lived abroad in many different places, been exposed to many different cultures, and used many different languages. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Susan. Always a pleasure. And
Yeah,
best. Okay.
yeah, see you. Thank you. Thanks again. Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.